Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning into today's webinar. I'm Dana Wassley, and I lead our transit business line here at the Mobility House. We're excited to host this webinar today, and we have a panel of experts with us who will share their insights into how you can put together a competitive low-no application. The Low or No Emission Vehicle Program is a grant program that is administered by FTA that provides funding to buy or lease zero emission and low emission transit buses, along with charging equipment and supporting facilities. The goal of the program is to support the transition of transit vehicles to low or no emission vehicles. For the 2024 round, there is $1.1 billion available, and applications are due April 25th. The purpose of this webinar is to focus on the components of your application that go beyond the bus. And we will specifically be focused on electric buses. The Low-No program can provide funding for other technologies as well, but for the sake of today's session, we will be focusing on battery electric buses. Today, we will hear from a panel of experts on how to incorporate the infrastructure and software that you need for your zero emission project into your Low-No application. So before we jump into panel questions, we will do a quick round of introductions to give you some background about who's on our panel today and some more information about the companies that they represent. Next slide, please. So starting out with some background on the Mobility House, and we can actually go to the next slide. We are a leading charging and energy management software provider, and we've deployed our smart charging software at more than 1,700 depots worldwide. Next slide, please. And here in North America, we are a leader in the public transit industry, and we've worked with many industry-leading agencies, including Antelope Valley Transit Authority, Long Beach Transit, and RIPTA, just to name a few. I am joined today by some of our amazing partners, so I will hand it over to Erik to introduce himself and CTE.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, Erik Bigelow, Engineering Director with the Center for Transportation and the Environment. A little bit about us. We're a nonprofit 501c3 engineering and planning firm. Our mission is to accelerate the adoption of zero-emission vehicles and do that through making zero-emission projects successful today, leveraging those lessons as we think about how to plan for vehicle deployments for the future, and leverage kind of our also historic data and lessons learned from projects that are in the ground now and up and running. Work nationwide across the country. Headquarters in Atlanta. I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and excited to be here today to talk about Low-No. Been working on Low-No since the start, so excited to help get more zero-emission technology out there. And I think Tim is next.
Please so. Yeah. So I'm Tim Victor with Scale Microgrids. I'm the Associate Director of eMobility. It's very excited to be here to talk about microgrids and also how that kind of can fit into the Low-No application. But broadly about Scale, Scale is a vertically integrated distributed energy platform, which really means that we're doing everything tip to tail when it comes to energy projects. We have our own capital financing so that we're able to provide these as a service and really do these really complex energy projects and really do them in a more simple way so that it's a lot easier for our customers to kind of deal with the complexities that come with a multi-asset type of project. Next slide. And just like I mentioned before, we really do tip to tail. So we're doing everything from feasibility analysis and audit to engineering design, pulling in the financing, and then additionally doing the construction, installation, and commissioning, as well as the long-term asset management. Many times we're working with partners like Mobility House and CTE to kind of fill in some of these pieces to make sure that we're able to really do a well-rounded approach. But in general, we're managing that entire process tip to tail. Next one. And this last slide is just really a really easy, kind of simple way of thinking about how this can kind of work through is what we're doing is we're really focusing on moving from that really simple charging infrastructure installation all the way up to these complex microgrids. And really what we're doing is we're moving the scale up and down depending on the complexity of the site. And we're able to kind of handle everything from very complex to more simple type of projects, but all built on this microgrid platform that allows growth to be more cost effective and also allows flexibility as this transition is going on for everybody in the transit industry. Awesome. I think we're off to Seb.
Thanks for joining us. So my name is Severin Skolrud. I'm Vice President for National Transit Rail Team. So WSP, we've been around for quite some time, over a century. We're just under 15 billion globally with 65,000 employees. We have been a part of the zero-emission fleet transition since the beginning. We specialize in infrastructure design, rolling stock procurement, you name it. We have done it. And so we have some sample images here where we have actually designed and deployed charging infrastructure across the United States, from just the early planning phases all the way through construction completion. And so our motto is plan and design for the end in mind. And so that's what we're going to be talking about throughout this webinar. And I'll turn it over to Mike Martin.
Yeah, so thanks, Sev. One of the things that I really I like to focus on when we talk about zero emission infrastructure and WSP is kind of, we just dive into this head first. Our facilities team here in Houston, 40 plus years of doing this and 16 for myself, we focus on the bus itself, how that operates. You know, large fleets, they're kind of a circus on a site. You've got to make sure that that ballet constantly works. Adding in zero emissions equipment has been a very large paradigm shift. We've gone from very rapid deployment of fueling up to getting that energy into a vehicle to slower time with charging, or more restrictions if you're looking at fuel cell. But when we look at that, it's just a change in the dwell times on the site. It means we have to kind of schedule that out better, which is a great time to speak to charge management. Anytime, any type of considerations there, we realize those two really go hand in hand. But when we look at this, the bus is the heartbeat. It's got to make service. We don't want ZE to be a lesser. It needs to be as good as conventional fuels, and that's what we've been working on. We understand buses. We focus on that. My team has done 800 plus of them across all of North America, and some global projects as well. And now 130 of those have tagged in somewhere or another to zero emissions. So really our focus is make sure service gets met, make sure these buses are as good or better than they were as a conventional fleet. And how do you do that? What are things that you need to look at early in a project, at a grant type stage? How do you do that and get ahead of it so that you make sure that this is a benefit to the entire industry, not just a change? And something we're excited to talk about today.
Awesome. Thank you all for those introductions. So we are going to go ahead and get started out with some planned questions that we have for the panel, and then we will end with audience Q&A. So please put any questions you have into the Q&A box so that we can get to those at the end. The first question that I wanted to start out with is, after the bus, kind of the most obvious project component is the chargers. So I figured we can start there. So how do you determine what type of chargers are needed for your electric buses? And what are some of the considerations that agencies should be thinking about when determining the scope of their charging infrastructure components of their project? And Sev, I know that WSP does a lot of work with transit agencies on this topic. So let's start with you.
Dana. So our team is comprised of economists, planners, engineers, architects, you name it. And so when we start a project, we bring everybody in from the beginning. And so as Dana mentioned, it does start in the planning phase as determining the fleet and facility conditions. You do have to look at your route modeling, which is a key component of all of this. And it can be a mix of both depot charging, but also on-route charging. And both improvements are allowable under the Low-No grant. And specifically, some of the constraints within the facility as far as the different charging infrastructure types that you're looking at, whether it's ground mounted or overhead, plug-in or pantograph. I want to let Mike speak to with his experience, because he is way much more of an expert than I am at this. So Mike.
Yeah, thanks,
Tell
Seb.
some more.
One of the things I would really, really focus on when you look at this is, where are you actually going with this? What is your overall ultimate transition going to look like? Some of the early stumbles that we saw from groups coming out were just focus on getting a handful of chargers of whatever technology you were using at the time, kind of as cheaply, as quickly as possible, and not focusing on, okay, but how will this fit into the entire picture? This is a very large puzzle we've got to put together. We don't want to put in 5-10 positions, have those dispensers then at odds with everything further downstream in your transition project. So looking at that in a methodical way, saying, all right, this is something that maybe we're going to tag into some existing power. Maybe we're going to actually start our first new feed, which means we then need to work with our utility to size all of that up from the get-go, load ramping, where we're going. How will these tie together? How can we get pieces of equipment that can, speak to each other, that can all be kind of phased in? The most important part of a large scale deployment we're finding is, how methodical were you with breaking it into constructible, fundable, and really operational, chunks between each stage. If we're going to put in the first 10 buses, that's great, but let's make sure that they don't take 30 buses offline for your nightly service cycle, especially when you start dealing with your subsequent stages where you're doing bigger portions of this. We have a great example out at San Diego where we're doing a phased approach and have our first set of 20 plus pantographs going in overhead. That's very, very important. So you need to make sure that you're not stubbing any toes on it. As far as technologies go, you need to look at your fleet. You're trying to get something that is as standardized as possible. Both pantographs and plugins have very firm standards that are kind of holding and driving. Some interest with how the NACS charger may end up coming in and changing that for dispenser connection, but back end is very similar. And induction is an interesting one too, especially for some of the viability of on a route. That one we see challenges with sometimes, because of the facts of there are dueling technologies and not a exact standard for that yet. So moving forward, you always want to kind of look for something that is going to be hard and fast, and pushing the industry in that way. And that's kind of what we speak to when we speak to manufacturers. That is what we work for when we look for design, and that future proofing, how you actually design for the technology that will be there tomorrow with the space and understanding and funds you've got today. So kind of a drink from the fire hose on that, but those are things that we get into early on in that process.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I think you actually started to touch on a really interesting point that our team hears a lot about as well. So one of the biggest challenges that we hear about as a charging management provider is, with charger installation projects, there are power capacity constraints that a lot of our clients run into, especially as they are scaling up their electric bus fleet. And, those capacity constraints can make a project more expensive, longer to implement, kind of all of those additional complexities. So the next question that I have for the panel is, what strategies have you helped agencies to deploy to address this challenge? And how can agencies include, different types of technology or scoping considerations into their Lono application to address these power capacity constraints? And Erik, I know that we've worked with CTE on some agencies that have run into this problem. So let's start with you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, and so for for a power capacity constraint, in our experiences, you have two angles really, two choices, two possibilities. One is the age-old talk to your utility, and you'll get the either sounds good or let's talk in 2030. And those are typically the two possibilities we hear from the utility side. The other is how you can manage that power. And then there's two from there, again, two maybe forks in the road. One is if your utility is willing, and we found this is really just a question you have to ask. Some utilities will only consider your connected load as what's allowable. So if you have 3 megawatts worth of chargers, they want to have a 3 megawatt service. Some utilities are a little more enlightened on that. And if you can prove to have a control system that handles that, and they can give you 1.8 megawatts and you can agree to keep that cap, then you're off to the races and can use that existing capacity effectively. So all of that in our experience that it's I know well-worn advice, but your utility is the gatekeeper on that. That first question, and then typically that service cost, if you're not paying for a service upgrade, it is relatively cheap compared to all of your other options, except maybe charge management, line extensions and anything else. And then another great option I want to hand to Tim to talk to is a microgrid approach as well. So from a capacity fix.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, one of the biggest things about microgrid.
Oh man, what timing.
I know it looks like we're having some internet connectivity issues. Hopefully, let's give him a couple of seconds here and see if he's able to come back.
Project that we really pitch here is if you're working with utility says we're not going to be able to provide power for 5 to 6 years, you can use a battery storage system to kind of bridge that gap. And then when that service comes in and then you have a larger service, you can use battery storage to reduce demand and offset peak time of use, things like that. And so you really have an ability to use this distributed energy, which is readily available, able to deploy on site within, a year or so. And you're able to kind of bridge that gap so that when you're doing this transition, it's a lot easier to kind of plan this out, because obviously nobody's doing all of their buses at once. If you do, I applaud you, but usually it's like a 20-30% at a time. And so what you're able to do is essentially add energy assets on site to make that transition easier, and also work with that utility so that gives them a little bit of breathing room to bring in that larger service in the future. Seb?
I was going to make a corny joke about your microgrid going offline, but I won't. To Tim's point and to Erik's point, as far as the relationships with the utilities, I think that's key. For all of the attendees that are on this webinar, I think to strengthen your proposal to be successful for these low-no grants, adding that letter of support from the utility, showing that there's a strong relationship and understanding of the transition is going to take you that much further into the acceptability and achieving those funds. And how you do that, similar to what Erik mentioned, as far as having these tough conversations about understanding the difference between peak and connected load and the potential monetary savings and also the operational savings of that is critical to being successful for getting those additional funds to support your infrastructure needs. One of the projects that we're currently supporting in the Mid-Atlantic is actually a shared bus depot between 2 different transit agencies. So you can imagine the type of utility conversations that we're having there and how important the role is for charge management is going to play at that depot. So with that, I'll pass it back. Thank you both.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that those are extremely helpful insights. And so, in addition to charging infrastructure, resilience is a really big topic of conversation right now as well. And so I was hoping that we could talk a little bit more about how agencies can include components like backup generators, solar, and battery storage as part of their low-no application. And Tim, I know Scale's obviously an expert in this space, so let's start with you.
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the first steps here is to really understand what resilient operations look like for a transit agency. I think that is a widespread answer that we've heard, ranging from, we don't need to operate during an outage to we have to be 100% ready to go if we don't have power. And so being able to understand exactly what the requirement is for your fleet during an outage really sets that standard of, okay, this is the level of performance that we need to meet if we weren't to have power. Then that gives you enough information to understand, okay, now we need this amount of power to be able to power these buses during an outage. The other detail of that is how long of an outage to be able to prepare for. If you have, backup power that's maybe available across the city and you're able to do mobile type of power, maybe you only need 2 to 4 hours of backup, and you can actually cover that gap while you're bringing in that additional backup generation. But then the next thing I'll kind of add there is using things like solar and battery storage is more than just resilient power. So really, those are working day to day. Those are reducing energy consumption as well as energy demand day to day. And then during an outage, you're able to utilize those as additional capacity during an outage. And that's the big piece here of a lot of these technologies in the microgrid, is that you can benefit from them day to day, as well as use them for resilient power in the back end.
I was just going to jump in real quick too to say, Kim, I think you're so spot on. The most important thing when you look at this is, what does that actually mean? Because, right now, sometimes folks will say, I need to have every single bus 100% of the time, 24/7, 365. That's not something we see really even in conventional fleets. It's not how they operate, just based on what you have for maintenance availability and other challenges during prolonged outages. But knowing what you can do in a short term, what you can do to make pullout if you just have a blip in the evening is very different from if you have an actual, disaster going on and you have a response fleet. So really early on, defining what that is and buying your early pieces of infrastructure and equipment so that they are aligned to, connect to whatever solution you're going to, or scale if that's something you're going to move towards later on. Very important from the very first, pilot programs and just thought process, all the way through that, final delineated all the way. We don't take any diesel on this site ever again kind of thought. So great point. I like where your head's at on that one.
Thanks, Mike. And the couple things I want to add too. So we're a plug for later in the year. We're working on a TCRP resilience guidebook with Scale as part of that project as well. So and an interesting outcome of that, as we've been doing some of the interviews around the country, is the variety of answers and preparation and kind of level of discussion that people are at today is all over the map, quite frankly, for how prepared folks are even to start the conversation on what resilience means, or already have a pretty good idea. And anyway, so I think starting with that definition is a great conversation. And it's so, I guess I always want to say it's okay. Want to go out for anyone listening. There's a lot of things that haven't been talked about much at all. So don't be afraid to start the conversation internally. So.
And just to add one more thing in there, I think the early planning piece is really important here, because when you're doing backup generation, when you're doing solar and battery storage, that is another load / generation source on site. And what you're doing is you're taking over space on site, you're taking over capacity of that grid service. And so being able to think about it early on allows you to get to the point of, okay, if I plan this out, I know that this site is ultimately going to need this much hosting capacity, both from battery storage, charging, solar, and you don't end up in a position where you paid a lot of millions of dollars to put in infrastructure that now that you want to add solar and battery storage, you now maybe pull that out and now you have to replace it with another piece of infrastructure. And so infrastructure planning is kind of something we always really harp on because we think it's a very easy thing to end up losing a couple $1 million on if you don't think about it right. And I think if you think about it up front as to what is my ultimate goal, how this transition comes through, and when things will show up, you have the ability to really plan this out and have a very cost-effective method of actually installing that infrastructure.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. I think that those are really excellent points. And I know that microgrids and these kind of other types of energy resources is a really important topic right now. So it's great that we're able to have this discussion, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye out for that resource that Erik mentioned earlier. Another question that we hear a lot in the industry is, what components of a zero-emission bus program can be included in a low-no application? Obviously, low-no is a capital grant program, but there are project components that are in kind of a gray area, like charging management software and other types of services. And so for this question, I guess if I'm going to ask the panel if they can maybe speak to how they've worked with agencies to include these types of components in applications in the past, and if there are any tips that you have on how to incorporate those types of components into a low-no application. And Sev, I'm going to start with you.
So as far as what's allowable, it is actually quite broad, which I think is advantageous, but it's a double-edged sword, because I think you need to make sure that your story is strong and a differentiator, just because the FTA receives hundreds and hundreds of these grants, and they're short-staffed, so you need to stand out. As far as leasing or procuring equipment, that includes rolling stock and charging infrastructure as a part of that. Building new facilities or rehabilitating existing facilities is also a part of that. One key point as far as the requirements of the grant, and related to your previous point, Dana, as far as how it relates to software, whether it's yard management or charge management software, and actually one of the questions that we've received is the option to rehabilitate improving existing public transportation facilities. And so the use case for charge management there is to improve the operations of the existing facility, lower the costs, and improve the amount of infrastructure that's actually required. And that can be achieved through charge management software. And so I think the FTA looks favorably, especially if you have a plan of not only partners are involved, but also approval from the utilities that you can actually plan for peak loads versus total connected.
Yeah, and Sev, I'm just going to chime in and harp on that one a little bit more with you. Ways that we really see that as advantageous is charge management can allow you to pick up more data from more buckets. And when I say that, I'm alluding to the fact that we know that this is now a lot more dwell time on a site for a vehicle, and it's a lot more infrastructure. You know, we don't have 2 to 4 diesel dispensers out there. We've got, you know, basically one per position split amongst different chargers. And how much time that has to be there is very important, and how many of those in the future, as we start looking at things like autonomous and other challenges, you know, benefits, but challenging in design to get ahead for, how much time do we have to dwell there? A lot of the kind of, you know, predictive analysis and charge management, understanding, you know, tying in dispatch, tying in PM work orders, all those buckets that we can get more data for what the bus actually has to do, what that single position needs to achieve, tie that in with utility to try and save money on, you know, on grid needs. All of that is very, very important, and they're great differentiators and grants, because it means that you can basically say, this has been fine-tuned as much as possible to get the biggest bang for the buck out of each plug-in, pantograph, induction, whatever position we're installing or vehicle we're putting out on the road. We're trying to get the most out of it because we're thinking it through and monitoring it and adapting to it in real time.
Yeah, I guess I don't know too. I know Dana kicked us off asking about, you know, this is a capital grants program. I would encourage folks to think of it through that lens as a capital program. And also just, you know, from a kind of federal cost principle, just because FTA approves the grant and pays you for it doesn't mean they won't reserve the right in the future to say they were wrong and ask for the money back. So do encourage the care on that. And you know, I think if one strategy on helping that out is including some of the first, you know, a reasonable number, you know, small digit number of years of a service as part of a capital project. So if you're buying a system that includes chargers and charge management, you can get that kind of at once upfront. And then I encourage everyone to have those kind of good conversations too for what that looks like in the future for renewals as well, you know, and what happens after that initial period runs out. But yeah, FTA is certainly looking, I think, to fund the pieces that make this successful. And really, my big caution is that when things cross over to look more like an operating cost, those are almost always unallowable, and there is a gray area between what is a capital and an operating. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are great points. And I know that when we've collaborated with agencies in the past on incorporating software into their applications, the years definitely do matter. So I think that like a lot of the time we're providing quotes for a longer subscription timeline, so 5 to 10 years in most cases for a lot of these applications. And then additionally, you know, some software programs like what we offer here at the Mobility House with ChargePilot does have those hardware components too. So some agencies have just opted to include the hardware components and then have an alternative way to pay for the subscription costs. So there's a lot of options that we've seen that can work. And so, yeah, it's just kind of thinking through what works the best for your agency and what makes the most sense for your application. Moving ahead to the next question here. I would love to hear from the panel. What is one part of a zero emission bus project scope that you think often gets overlooked when putting together a low-no application? And Erik, let's start out with you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think some of those ongoing costs and kind of an opportunity to capitalize is occasionally. Sometimes that can be like extended warranties, so I'd encourage folks to think through how their agency thinks about success and how to remove future pain points. And this is a great opportunity to get those funded. And then also just the cautionary flag to fly on kind of future cost increases and having those discussions with your vendors on how that's going to work out down the road. Hopefully we're over the biggest bump of kind of inflation that we've seen, but it's certainly a challenge to work through for everyone's budgets. So in thinking about how to make sure you have enough room to cover the costs you need. So
I was just going to add in there that one of the things that I think should be heavily influencing these types of decisions is really thinking about oversizing and how to properly do that. These low-no applications are single, influxes of money to be able to utilize for hardware, but you still have to think about the fact that these are 15, 20, 25-year assets that you're putting in the ground. And so you want to make sure that whatever you're purchasing now is still going to be useful at that end of its life, so that you can actually still use the things that you're purchasing now in the future. And there's ways to kind of make sure that you're able to do that. Things like making sure that you're sizing switchgear and panel boards for the future, as opposed to what you're doing in this first phase, or being able to understand how that transition will actually look as you bring in more power. I think a worst case scenario here is you're essentially sectioning things off so much so that you have a certain size service from the utility. It matches with the service, or it matches with the switchboard, and then you have to do that 3 times over at that site, and you end up with essentially a very segregated type of installation. Whereas if you've been a little bit more forward thinking, you're able to kind of think about, okay, I can host 2 phases on this same size, this larger panel board, and being able to think about it through that way. So just thinking about how you can upsize things up front to make it easier in the future.
And I'll jump in and toss in one more that I think folks are starting to wrap their heads around, but it's an important one, and it's one that folks who work the transit world magic have been doing for a century, keeping all this equipment maintained, running, and then having kind of a rapid response when anything goes bump in the night. So just building in some space, some capacity, some understanding of how you're actually going to address this equipment into your early, even when you're chasing funds, defining what you might need to actually store some of these components. If you have anything on site, replacement parts, pieces that you need to be able to access, and addressing the equipment itself, making sure that you don't design so tight that you have train every single time you need to make a modification on a piece of equipment or get in there and address it. So storage for parts, building that into, if you need any kind of special storage, for electronics, you name it, building those in early, getting those costs considered. It's a reality check that we need to make sure we're addressing, because you got to keep a lot of new equipment up and running constantly that you haven't had to think about before. It's a much larger load than a lot of entities have taken on. So something to sharpen the pencils on early instead of figuring out where to squish it in later.
Absolutely. I think all of those are really good points, and definitely important for agencies to be thinking about as they're putting together their applications this year. The next question that I have here, so the Low-No program has an option to list project partners as part of their application. And so obviously different agencies will have different procurement policies, but for agencies that do have internal policies that allow for listing project partners, I'm really curious about what advice you have for selecting project partners, and then also if you could speak to any additional advantages that there may be to putting specific partners in your application. And Tim, I know that Scale has a lot of experience as being a listed partner, so let's start with you.
Yeah, so as much as I love being maybe one of the few options to be listed on a low-no application, I do suggest that kind of everybody kind of go out and do their homework. Actually, one of the ones that we're working on right now on low-no right now, CTE actually sat as essentially kind of the in-between and actually vetted all the vendors for the transit agency. And so you can do things like that, where I would suggest having your third-party consultant who has an independent view of how to do this kind of go out and actually vet some of these vendors for you, so that you're providing some sort of comfort where when you do list them on that low-no application, you know that you're not going to want to backtrack on that choice, because really what it does is it does speed that system or that process up. Now you have your vendor on board, you have your procurement requirements met, and you're able to kind of move directly into the contracting phase. And so what I would suggest is having a third party type of entity, or doing it yourself, and making sure that you really are looking at the multiple different options, picking who you think has the ability to really perform and do what you're asking him to do before you kind of sign up and have them on that low-no application. Though it is very strategic and nice to be named in that low-no, so that you have the ability to move directly to contracting. You can get things done a lot quicker.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah. And I'd say too, I mean, this is one of the very few options in all of federal procurement and funding that allows this. And I take that as a sign that FTA encourages this method, this procurement method effectively, in order to speed things up and reduce labor and effort on getting procurements in place. So, you know, we work on other procurements where it's specifically in bright bold letters not allowed to name partners, and you know, absolutely 100% must be. So as the strong exception to that, where possible, do that. And then I would suggest it where it's possible. And if it's not, that's okay too. You know, we work with folks every year where it's like, well, we can't make that decision today, or we just don't know the answer to this. And we've had some awards where or a vendor wasn't known. You know, this is thinking more about a particular vehicle class that just wasn't available at the time of the application, which we're still awarded. So make the best choice for your agency, but I guess I would recommend taking the leap if possible, because it does, if you can get comfortable with the partners, it's a great opportunity.
Awesome. And then the last question that we have planned before we jump over to audience Q&A is going to just kind of be like a round table. So as a final question, what is one thing that you want transit agencies to know as they put their low-no applications together this year? And Sev, let's start with you.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm sure all of the attendees are very familiar with their facilities, their fleet, the needs for their transition in order to be successful. What I will say is the broader goals of the FTA are very much community driven. And so incorporating these benefits from a carbon emission reduction standpoint, the value overall for what your new low zero emission system will provide are key to include, and make sure that your story stands out, and that you're different from the rest. Your situation and challenges are unique, but you have a plan in place to make sure that you can execute. Like Erik had hinted at, while very few, there are some instances where FTA will pull their money if in fact it's not being spent accordingly. So making sure that you have your primary and secondary plan in place is important. So Mike, I don't know if you have anything additional to add from an infrastructure standpoint.
Yeah, one other item that I think is extremely key when we look at, low-no or really any project, but it's just looking at this as a holistic approach. There's often, when we get into this, we get into the weeds, we focus on exactly what we're achieving with this, this single point of data that we're trying to work towards, but looking at how that's going to tie into, your entire city, how your actual operations are going to go, if it's going to mean, modifications to your routes, if it's going to mean, driving towards capacity at a new facility, kind of a master plan type approach, and not just focusing in one little piece that we're trying to achieve, but looking at all of your facilities, all of your conditions as they stand today, and then that end goal of, We all know that we are heading towards a future of full zero emissions. It's the end goal, I think, for everyone in the industry at this point. But we want to understand how we really get there that's realistic, not just kind of, band-aiding each portion one at a time. This has got to be smart design, where you look at every single piece today, where it goes tomorrow, all at once. You can't always fund that on one project, but coming into that, having that mindset, I think, is the differentiator between folks who access this and have great success for their agency, and folks who just get some funds and use them and move on to the next piece.
One thing I guess I'll build on that too is like to say, sort of as the national electrification journey has proceeded in the last decade or so in this, that first the question was on the, will the buses work? That's answered, they work. Will the chargers work? Yes, that works. And after that is kind of, we're in the everything else period. There's a lot of pieces and that to make that work. And I guess what I'd encourage folks to think about, that one is, what does your agency need in that part of everything else? Thinking past, hey, we need buses, hey, we need chargers, and that may be kind of unique. There are a number of software vendors out there to fill gaps, and the last kind of closing part on that is FTA strongly recommends, to the point of you have to make a reason not to say how you'll spend the 5% on the workforce development funds. But we've seen those be as implemented, and further guidance has come out pretty open-ended in what those workforce development funds can be spent. So there's apprenticeship programs, childcare for people, uniforms. So there's a really wide open range on how to spend that 5%. And again, FTA needs you to write a really well reasoned argument on why you're not taking the 5%. So do check with how that can best be used for your agency, and would encourage, this is one of the few places where I'd say I'd encourage, to figure out the details later. If you're not sure how to spend the 5% today, say workforce development, and use that kind of sort of generational possibility we're getting in how to build up your organization.
Awesome. So yeah, I think we can transition over to some of the audience Q&A. So the first question that we have here is, are there ways to optimize combining depot full charge and on-route top-off vehicle charging? So I guess I believe this question is going to kind of focus on kind of what are the trade-offs, I guess, of depot versus on-route charging, and how do you select what makes the most sense for your agency?
Well, I guess I think if I understand the question is from maybe a hardware side standpoint, and if that's the case, building on what Mike was saying, this is really a planning question on how you get the technology to fit your needs with the right balance of risk and what can go wrong. So if it's the hardware question, there really isn't a good answer, except kind of careful planning. From a deployment standpoint, there's a few vendors out there that we're aware of and have worked with to help answer the more real-time question, like, what do I do on Tuesday? What do I do today to make this whole system work? And there's, I like to say, up to about 5 or 10 buses, you can figure this out as you go, and past that number, it's too much to keep in a planner's head, and you need some sort of system to help answer that question.
And I'll chime in there, all excellent points, Eric. The other point that I would kind of focus on when you do this is align your technologies that work, under each scenario. But let's just assume you're pushing towards a depot scenario and augmenting it with an on-route type of top-off as needed for your more challenging routes. So you're going to look at that with your route modeling day one, and as your fleet transitions over your procurement strategy, one of the ways we really work with that is try and align where you're putting your first vehicles that have, we're just going to say it, lower range, because technology gets better and better and better and better, and we're seeing ranges extend and charge rates get faster, and everything, buses getting lighter. All the good things are happening over time. So trying to align kind of the technological improvements with your procurement schedule, hit some of your lower hanging fruit routes first, which is again a big challenge because we also need to make sure that we're not just saying, hey, we're cherry picking the simplest ones and that's what we're doing, and we stuck them all in this one neighborhood. Equity becomes another big part of this. We need to make sure that we're hitting the entire area, the entire region's needs, and kind of spreading that out equally. But looking within those, finding what works with your technology today, and folding in, your strategy on procurement side to align those as much as possible. That really helps to kind of balance the needs, minimize where you have to do excess, on route charging, which is always going to be one more piece of equipment to maintain, one more remote area to send folks out to. So that typically is a little bit more of a challenge. There's no magic crystal ball, but that's a way to get ahead of it a little bit and design early. And Sev, I see you've got a hand up.
Point to add, as far as what Mike is saying, is it's important to remember there are short range and long range batteries, and that can have impacts on the type of charging infrastructure that you're going to be planning for. And that's critical for how you're going to be managing not only your fleet, but also your service requirements as well. Something that we do, while a lot of firms offer route modeling services capabilities, we also try to go a step further and also model for the facility energy needs as well, because that's also important. And you can plan down to the minute of pull in, pull out times to further optimize your energy needs, and that's going to help you plan how much on-route charging you may need to complement that in order to meet your daily service requirements.
Perfect. So I guess going to the next audience question here, and I think we touched on this a little bit when we were doing our panel discussion, but the next one is, do you think that the LONO-NOFO allows for including the costs of charge management into a grant application? Where do you think that fits in with the language?
Yeah, Dan, I guess that I think it's, again, just a good, take good care there to make I think the safest thing is to include it as part of a capital purchase, as a, for instance, using Mobility House as an example, buy the site controller that comes with a few years of service. And I think that's probably the safest way. So yeah, I guess the short answer. Yeah,
absolutely. And then the next question that we have here is specifically to Tim. Do you find, oh, sorry, it just moved. Do you find upfront CapEx a challenge for site owners that microgrid as a service can solve and offer a bridge to those financial barriers, or capacity constraints and resilience as the primary driver to deploy microgrids? So I think this is asking, is it really the financial barrier, or is resilience and capacity constraints kind of the main goal of the microgrid?
It really depends on the priorities of the transit authorities. So we've had some transit authorities say, resilience is a requirement. And from that perspective, they've pushed to essentially say, the finances, they need to be as great as they can, but we're going to figure out a way to make this work. I think one of the parts that Erik was kind of talking about with FTA funding and using them as capital expense, as you can kind of see, that's kind of the opposite of the business model we're trying to work with, which is essentially trying to reduce these large complex projects down to yearly operational costs. But really what we're trying to do now is we're trying to partner with transit authorities to figure out how that actually works with FTA funds. And that's one of our goals over the next couple of years is, how do you leverage FTA funds to still enable these types of long-term projects? Because once you get to the point that you're putting in solar and battery storage and a generator and microgrid switchgear, you really get to this complex type of operation where it does benefit to have a partner who's willing to stand there and take the risk on that operation. And really what we're trying to figure out, and we're doing this with multiple agencies, is coming to the table and saying, how do we leverage FTA funds to maybe buy down this service cost over the long term? Or how do we leverage these funds, these capital funds coming from the federal side to essentially come in and reduce this operational burden costs over the long term? There's multiple different mechanisms that we think there's paths forward. I don't have an exact answer on exactly how to do that right now, but we are actively pursuing that with FTA and a few partners to try to figure this out. To kind of better answer the, capacity constraints or resilience side, those are kind of both pretty equal. On the capacity side, a lot of these are taking in so much power that we aren't able to really produce that much power on site with zero emission technologies. And we know that. And so what we're trying to do is essentially lessen the blow and really try to make this transition better, and working with the utilities, understanding what they can provide and then optimizing on top of that. So we're not coming in and providing 100% off-grid projects. We can do that, but we don't necessarily see that as the opportunity or the way to kind of do these types of projects. So capacity constraints are definitely something we're solving, but we're not necessarily solving them for the next 20 years. What we're doing is providing that gap or that time frame so that we can allow these capacity constraints to actually fix themselves over time. And then you have the ability to provide backup power or economic savings on your day-to-day bills with this asset that's already on site.
Thanks, Tim. The next question that we have here, I think it is potentially for me, it's how much upcoming service planning information is needed to allow the charge management software to work properly, and can interfacing between them be included in the Lono application? So for the first part of that question, I can speak to that a little bit and then allow our panel to chime in as well. So really, I guess from our standpoint, the service planning is important because obviously when you're working with a different type of technology, the really important part for us is that you have enough time to charge your buses between blocks. So that typically does require service planning upfront with, folks like Erik from CTE or Severin Mike from WSP to kind of figure out how those electric operations will work. We do offer some modeling and consulting as well, where we are able to model your loads based off of your fleet schedules. And that will allow us to kind of show you what's feasible with charging management based on when your vehicles need to leave the depot. So it's definitely an important component, I would say, of implementing a charge management software. And of course, there are a number of different types of factors and constraints that our software Charge Pilot would be optimizing around to take things into account, like your site capacity constraints, your utility rate structures, your fleet schedules. And it's really all of those things combined that we are optimizing for in real time at your site. I'll open it up to the panel if they have any additional thoughts on charging management, how to do service planning to help kind of plan for that, and then also including them in the Lono, I guess, as we've kind of already touched on.
Well, I think the including in the Lono, we'll all keep hammering on. You kind of put that on capital side, get your hardware, get your agreement there, and that's a hard and fast. We think that is going to stand up to scrutiny. As far as how much information is needed to make it work, I think one of the big challenges there, and I'll defer a little bit here since I'm not the actual charge management producer here, but often it's what are you trying to get out of it? And so that's a big key. Is it just, are we doing a handful of these? What time of day are we turn them off and on? Or are you trying to align it with how much really are we looking at the maintenance side? Anything on just putting in your PM schedules, understanding rapid repair kind of responses. So that's where I think when some of the differentiation here might be. Modeling your routes, key. Putting in those extra pieces, I think, is a big question and consideration for how far we want to take this. My answer is certainly as we move forward, I want this to be as every single piece of data as you can get into that, down to the minute, down to the second. Where's that vehicle? Where's it going to be? And what's going to happen if it's where it's not supposed to be? That's what I think is probably going to be the most interesting next part. When we especially start looking at autonomous to say, hey, something went wrong here. We have a vehicle that went into a diagnostic or parked itself. So some big challenges on that. Probably put a little bit more mud in the water on that one, but it's just things that we really want to focus on how granular we can get.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a great point, Mike. I think that something else to consider about, when you're looking at charging management and how that impacts your operations and how does that fit into how you already are, operating your vehicles. Something that we've been thinking a lot about at the Mobility House is this concept that we like to call the software ecosystem. So many times, transit agencies are already using, different types of software like dispatch, scheduling, transit asset management, depot management. And what we've found is that really for seamless operations, it's really important for these software systems to work together. And so we have partnered with several companies in the industry like Giro with their Hostas Yard Assistant program and several other types of software systems in the industry to really allow for that seamless integration. So in real time, we're able to send, the live charging statistics over to a depot management software so that people can see, hey, charger 10 is unavailable. It's probably best not to direct a bus over there right now. It should go to charger 8, that kind of issue. It also allows us to receive those schedules in real time. So if you have to replan, if maybe the bus you plan to have go out in 30 minutes has an issue and you have to reassign a different bus to that block, that all of that information will get transferred in real time and really allow for that seamless operation. So you don't have to manually go in and re-optimize things as things are changing at your site. Obviously, transit operations are very complex. So these types of kind of integrations and considerations is really important. And one of kind of the newer topics, I would say, in the industry that we've been paying a lot of attention to.
And I guess a small thing to add on that too is that having the right there's two different levels of kind of goals and I guess outcomes to think about. And, and I'll like build on something, a project that we have working with Mobility House. And for this client, really the main thing they can do to save money is just not charge in the peak time. Everything else is fine. They can save a little more money by levelizing their load, which Mobility House platform can handle. But for the most part, if they don't charge, they get, 75% of the benefit of the possibility by just making sure they don't charge during that peak window. So I think it's important to know where the benefits come in. In some places, it's the opposite, where managing your peak demands is really the question. And I bring that up because it influences the kinds of information that you need to be able to provide and manage. I'm a fan of not scheduling things too close, so you need enough kind of flexibility in your system to handle any of those upsets. But I think there's an important question here on kind of scope and outlook too, for like, is this solving today's problem or solving the problem for 5 years from now? And the today problem, I think it's important not to make it too complicated so you have a successful, robust system. But again, looking towards, fleets of tens, dozens, hundreds of vehicles needs some sort of automated system, and that will require a lot of information sharing to be successful. So.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, so much. I hope everyone has a great rest of their Friday and a wonderful weekend.